Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here and welcome back to the railway. Here in the 2020s we enjoy mostly fantastic model train performance. Our models are smooth, they are quiet, they are powerful and they are reliable. But were they always like that? And how did we get to where we are now? Well, today we are going on a journey back in time to find out. Today's journey actually starts with a bit of an unboxing because inside this box I have an example of the earliest design of electrical model train mechanism I have in the entire collection, which dates back to around 1938, so we're talking pre-World War II with this. I do specify electric because of course clockwork was quite a thing during this era, but unfortunately I don't have a single example of a clockwork locomotive in my collection, so we are going to have to jump straight to electric. Let's show you what's inside here then. Now unfortunately I do not have a 1930s electric loco in my collection, but this loco inside here does feature more or less the same design. So what have we got? So this is a Wren City of Stoke-on-Trent. This is much more modern than the locomotives I'm describing. However, the Wren locomotives are re-releases of older Hornby Dublo locomotives, and it is these that I'm talking about. Now I believe it was the early N2 locomotives, or the 062s, that were the kind of early Dublo locomotives to run on electric, and they had a very similar mechanism to this. So they too had this vertical armature with the massive coils, as you can see. They didn't have this exact design, they were a bit more primitive. I believe they had sort of horseshoe magnets instead of these sort of more modern sophisticated magnets, but more or less it was quite a similar design. As you can see, the motor takes up an awful lot of space, and that was absolutely critical to locomotives like this, because of course plastic models wouldn't become the norm until around 1950, and obviously the only alternative to that was tin plate or die-cast metal. And obviously both of those are very heavy, and that is a real characteristic of these locos, even the Wren ones, incredibly heavy. And of course also rolling stock was incredibly heavy as well. And so, to overcome all of that drag and to produce the force required, the motors in these things had to be very, very large. So they weren't really optimized for fantastic low-speed performance or maximum smooth performance. They really were designed just to be powerful enough to do the job. So, let's get this Duchess down onto the track and do our first performance test of the day. Okay, so the Duchess is down onto the track, and I've got a bit of a stat screen popping up on the left for you, and I'm going to do that for every loco I'm going to test today, just so that you can compare them if you want to. Anyway, just a little disclaimer, I suppose, to start off with. Obviously, I am running all of these locos and I'm describing their performance from my perspective here in the 2020s. Some models, like this one, are quite old. Maybe they're not running as well today as they would have been when they were new. Maybe modern controllers are not optimized for this kind of loco. So if you remember your models running better than I'm showing mine running, then comment down below to let me know. But I'm not trying to insult your childhood toys or anything like that. I'm just showing how they compare sort of today. So this locomotive, very, very heavy, as you would have seen. Let's see what the performance is like. As you can see, it is working quite nicely. There we go. I will do a crawl in just a second. It's not that bad, is it? It's reasonably smooth, quite impressive. I dare say the older versions of this mechanism, you know, the ones made in the 30s and 40s, maybe they would not have been this smooth. I mean, this has a slightly finer worm drive on it, I believe. The original ones would have been much coarser, so this is probably about the best you could possibly have hoped for in the 1930s. Does seem a bit sluggish though, I have to say. If I hit this with 50% speed suddenly, watch this. It's like a real slow acceleration. So even though it's got a huge motor inside it, it still takes quite a lot of time for it to get up to speed and accelerate this mass of locomotive, which is pretty serious at nearly 700 grams. So that's that. How is the slow speed performance? I'm not expecting great things from this, but let's see. I'll try and get a crawl out of it. You know what, it's not actually that bad, is it? It is hard to get a controlled crawl, and it's certainly not up to the standard of modern locos. And I have taken care of this, you know, it's had a good service and whatnot. But as you can see, it's cogging quite heavily because these motors are very much geared and designed for power rather than slow speed performance. So crawling is not easy. And I must say this is quite typical of the other locos I have with this mechanism. But in terms of how smooth it is, yeah, it's absolutely fine. So there you have it. That is an example of the earliest design of mechanism I have to show you today. And this design was pretty much all you could get your hands on in this era. Right through the 1940s, this was about it. And Wren, after Hornby Dublo, continued to make these models right up until the early 1990s, which is insane, isn't it? However, it was 1950 when things would change massively. And to sum up that massive change that took place in 1950 in a single word, plastic. Rovex, or later known as Triang, introduced their first Princess locomotive in 1950 in a Marks and Spencer train set. Now, again, to be clear, this is not the 1950 Princess. The 1950 Princess was much cheaper and nastier than this, but this does use the same body and it uses the same basic mechanism. So the use of plastic made a massive difference to the model train industry. First of all, plastic bodies are lighter and they're also cheaper to produce. And that removed the need for such a massive, powerful motor. And as you can see, this, the XO3 to XO4 motor, is much, much smaller than the one we saw on the likes of the old Hornby Dublo locomotives. And also because rolling stock became plastic as well, there wasn't as much drag in the trains either. So plastic trains, for the first time ever pretty much, made model railways less of an elite hobby. It became more accessible to children. But like I say, that first Princess was much nastier than this. It was a bit too cheap and nasty, if you ask me. I believe even the chassis and the wheels of that locomotive were made of plastic. It did not pick up power through its wheels like the slightly better Hornby Dublo locos of the time did. It had a pair of metal plungers, I believe, somewhere around this sort of area, that touched the track and picked up power that way. Wasn't very reliable, wasn't very nice, but it was only this initial Princess that had that kind of mechanism. Very soon it was upgraded to a metal chassis with metal wheels, and then I think from that point the models really became comparable to the Hornby Dublo locos. Not necessarily in terms of the detail, I mean these still had the moulded detail and such, but certainly in terms of mechanism, these were running the same if not slightly better than the Hornby Dublo locos. So let's have a go with the Princess. Let's see what this one runs like. Again, if this was a 1950s Princess, it wouldn't be running as well as this one is about to. So as you can see, still really nice and smooth. Really about as smooth as the Hornby Dublo, and except it was obviously much, much cheaper. It's also much less sluggish because there's a lot less weight here. So again, if I hit this with 50% speed, look at that, almost full speed straight away. And how is the crawl? Bear in mind there's a lot less weight to shift here. Let's have a look. I think that's about the best we're going to get out of this one. So not very impressive, but some locos with this motor are definitely much better than this, and I'll show you one of those later on. It could be that this motor's got a bad coil or something. Like I say, it's old, it's not brand new anymore, but still reasonably smooth. But this was the basis of Triang and then Hornby's designs for many, many years to come. They were using this motor and this sort of chassis design right up until the early 1980s. I believe 1981 seems to be about the end of this era. And one of the last locos to be produced during this era was the 57XX pannier tank. So here's a quick look at one of the later locomotives to use this mechanism. I believe it was this pannier tank, the 57XX, and also the Ginty that were still using this motor by the time 1980 came around. Yeah, it is basically the same mechanism as the Princess. I think you'd agree though, this one seems a little bit smoother, a little bit quieter perhaps, and we'll see whether or not the crawl is any better. I think it should be, let's see. Yeah. So it's quite coggy, not the smoothest in the world, but considering it is that very same motor design from 1950, it's considerably better, isn't it? So they weren't always that bad. Again, controllers in those days weren't as good as the one I'm using now, so whether or not locos were really crawling this well back in the 50s, 60s, 70s is another thing. But I think given the age of this thing, it isn't too bad at all. But after 1981, or around that sort of time, there was a big change in the way Hornby, as they were then known, assembled their mechanisms. The chassis design and the basic design of their engines remained pretty much the same, but they changed the motors. So from approximately the early 1980s, Hornby stopped using the XO3 motor and they started fitting this, the Type 7 motor, instead. Now, newly designed loco chassis were built to incorporate that motor, and some existing models, the B12 is a good example, were just adapted to fit this new motor. As you can see, it's a much smaller motor than the XO3 was, and that's because technology had advanced and motors could be smaller, they could perform better, and they could be more efficient. And this motor design is still produced today, and it's still very cheap. These cost you around £1.50 or something like that, so it's easy to see why this very simple one-piece motor would be so much cheaper than the more complex, larger, and more difficult to assemble motor. So here I've got a 2721 pannier tank, which originally did have the XO3 motor, but the version I have here does have the new Type 7 motor. So let's have a look at the performance. I think it's clear to see that this is even smoother. Look at this. It's not really had much of a run recently, this one, but it's still a really decent runner. And let's take a look at what the crawl is like, shall we? Let's try and get this to go real slow. So better again, yeah, definitely an improvement in the crawl. The Type 7, I'll be honest, it's not my favourite motor in the world. I've had quite a lot of them fail, but they are so cheap and they do perform so well that I guess it's quite easy to forgive them, isn't it? Oh, almost cut out there. This loco, by the way, I guess this is a development that ought to be mentioned, does have rubber traction tyres on it. Not my favourite solution. It does of course mean that locos can be lighter and cheaper, and the rubber traction tyres make up for the deficit in pulling power, but it also means that at least one set of power pickups is lost, because obviously rubber doesn't conduct. But at least in this case, the centre driving wheels are actually touching the track. That wasn't the case with the earlier Princess and the other pannier that I showed you. They had dummy centre driving wheels so that they could negotiate tighter curves. But there was another type of mechanism that helped to replace the old XO3 motor, and that is of course the Ringfield motor. And this was developed to put into the 1971 9F Evening Star because they couldn't find a way to drive the locomotive wheel set, so instead they developed the Ringfield motor, which went inside the tender. However, after the 1971 Evening Star, many of Hornby's new tender locomotives featured the Ringfield motor. And I think the reason is that locomotives themselves vary so much in shape and size, but their tenders didn't. A tender is more or less the same on any locomotive in terms of its dimensions. So it was much easier to adapt a mechanism to fit into tenders than it was to fit into locomotives. And so tender drive became the norm from the early 1970s onwards. And that is how Hornby did things for the next 30 years or so. Many newly designed tender motors were fitted with the Ringfield, the Black 5 being another early one. So here I have a slightly later example of the Hornby Ringfield motor in the 2800 class, which was actually developed in the 1990s. But I've had to choose this one because it's one of the few tender drive locos I have that still has its original Ringfield motor. I've replaced a lot of the older ones with more modern motors. But this is pretty much the same as the original design. It's only really, I think, the 9F that had the completely original design. It's quite primitive. After the 9F, they upgraded it and made it a little bit easier to manufacture. But how is this one in its performance? Let's have a look. So noticeably fairly quiet. These locos do also have traction tyres, which overcame the weight problem in the tender, of course. and fairly smooth. I mean, they were quite serviceable, so if things went wrong, the modeler themselves could probably fix the issue. And let's see what the speed and the torque is like. Let's hit it with 50 again and see how it accelerates. So pretty good, yeah, about the same as the other locos, I would say. And how is the crawl? Let's have a look. I don't think these were the best crawlers in the world. Not as good as the Type 7, I don't think, but we'll see how this one is. So, yeah, not amazing or anything, but probably I would say in line with what a lot of the other locos have been like. Yeah, that's for sure. So there you have it. That is a little section on the ring-filled motor, and of course the same design of mechanism was adapted into many Hornby diesels as well, which just had this mechanism mounted over one of their bogies. Countless examples of that, of course. Until 1976, the company that we know today as Hornby was king of model railways. But that changed when Palitoy introduced the first of their mainline range, and that was this, the J72. Incidentally, also technically the start of Bachmann as we know them today, but I'll come back to this loco later. Because here I have a 1979 mainline Royal Scot, which has a more original mainline mechanism inside it. And Mainline Palitoy, they took the model railway industry by storm because their models were massively further ahead in terms of detail and accuracy than what Hornby were already producing. And of course that gave Hornby a real kick up the bottom as well to force them to start improving that sort of thing. Mechanically though, I don't think they were really much of an improvement, if any at all, over what Hornby were already doing. Their steam locomotives, like this one, used what was really a smaller and weaker version of the Hornby ring-filled motor. Much smaller armature. Don't get me wrong, these mechanisms did run very well, so I'm told, but I've never had an awful lot of luck with them. So let's give the mainline Royal Scot a little bit of a test. Loads of locos like this, including the Patriot from 1980, which was basically the same thing, and also the Colic class is a classic one as well. That was from a little bit later on. Anyway, let's see if this thing works. As you can see, it does. It's not that bad. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it's awful or anything, but yeah, I much prefer the Hornby mechanisms from this era. But you can't deny that in terms of looks, these models were way ahead of their time and way ahead of Hornby. Anyway, how is the slow crawl? Let's have a look. Don't hold your breath. So these were split chassis locomotives. They did not have pickups, which obviously reduces drag. Another reason why I guess the motors could be so much smaller. There we go. So that's the best I can do on a crawl. Again, this is old. This is probably from the 1979 release of this loco. So yeah, it's probably going to have been better when it was first produced. But the same is true of every other loco that you've seen today. And yet this is the worst performer. So I guess what I can say is that these mechanisms don't age well, and it's why I don't really recommend buying old mainline locos because they have a tendency to fail, and those of you who have owned a mainline warship will definitely know that. And they take a lot of maintenance as well. Yeah, not particularly nice things to own. Let's see how they start. Let's give this 50% power. Still speeding up, no, slowing down again. So yeah, not very good. I don't think they would have been as bad as that back in the day. Again, this is an aging example, but they ran well enough at the time, and certainly they were good enough to give Hornby a bit of competition. And then next, after the demise of Mainline, the range was continued under Bachmann, who changed and kept on releasing some of the old Mainline models, and as you know, they also started developing their own. So even though this J72 originally had a very different mainline-based mechanism, this is a Bachmann version of the model. Same body, same detailing, but they changed the motor for a can motor, and I think they pretty much redesigned the entire chassis. And this was the basis for Bachmann locos moving forward for many years. Split chassis, can motor, good performance, but the locomotives were not that long lasting. So let's show you this one running. Again, it could probably do with a warm-up, but you can noticeably see how much better this is than the mainline loco I just showed you. Much smoother, not much quieter I would say, it's probably about as noisy, but the can motor there performing much, much better. And Bachmann continued to use this kind of design for many years, 90s, even into the early 2000s. This was the sort of thing you would see from Bachmann. Let's see what the crawl is like then. This is just a 3-pole can motor, I think the first we've seen today, but already you should start to see some serious improvements. Let's have a look. Turning up. Look at that, I think it's going. There we go. I should say this model in particular, even though the design dates back so far, this was manufactured much more recently, I think in 2007, something like that. So this is one of the last manufactured of this kind, but the mechanism does date back to the post-mainline days. So there you go. And I think this is really the turning point, isn't it, for really good running locomotives. It's what gave Bachmann their reputation for good running locos, and from this point you really start to see great performance. Before this point, they were kind of more toy-like, weren't they? Fast-running trains, just designed to do the job. It's really at this point that we start to see them designed to run realistically, smoothly, slowly, and this is just a fantastic example. And there are absolutely tons of Bachmann locos that run on this kind of design, and the tender locos are similar as well. It was a few of Bachmann's diesels that would be the first of their locos to move away from the split chassis design, which wasn't great because the two halves of it had to be insulated, and also the axles had to be plastic in order to isolate the two wheels. This locomotive, such as the Peak, is one of the early Bachmann locos that did not have split chassis, using regular pickups instead, and also a can motor in the centre. And this is pretty much the way Bachmann diesels are built to this day. So let's give this thing a test. Obviously, as a diesel, it could use a much larger can motor than as seen in the steam locos up to this point. And so the performance on Bachmann locos like this from the early 2000s really was absolutely amazing, and it still is to a degree. Look at this thing. So this is performance. I think we're here. I think we're at modern day really with this sort of performance. The detail still had a ways to go and that sort of thing, but in terms of the raw performance, I mean, this thing is just an absolute beast. I'll cut the power in front of you. Look at that, massive flywheels, of course. Yeah, this is really the modern age. And with Bachmann's diesels, they were definitely first to do this. I think at this point, Hornby were still using ring-filled motors in a lot of their diesels, but Bachmann were miles ahead with this sort of thing, that's for sure. So while the early 2000s saw Bachmann drive ahead of Hornby in terms of their diesels, it was this era where Hornby steamed ahead of Bachmann in terms of their steam locomotives. Because in the year 2000 to 2001, around that sort of time, Hornby came out with a whole new generation of steam locomotives, one of the first of which being this, the Merchant Navy class. Now, for the first time in years, the level of detail here was up to the same standard, if not slightly better than what Bachmann were doing. But what we're interested in today was the mechanical side. Because for years and years, Hornby had been producing those ring-filled motor-based locos, but here for the first time, we see an upgrade. So this thing was loco-driven for the first time in years, motor back in the locomotive, not just a motor, but a high-quality 5-pole motor, the same motor in fact that Hornby still use to this day in many of their locos. Proper bearings on the driving wheels, that became the norm for Hornby following this point, something that would take Bachmann another, 10 to 15 years to finally adopt properly into their locos. So with that, we've got a 2000 Merchant Navy from Hornby. Let's see what the performance is like on this. So, I mean, these were smooth running like no others. They really were. Get a load of that. And let's see what the crawl is like. Obviously, the crawl is fantastic on these locos, but let's prove it. There we go. I think it is actually moving there. Or is it? I can't actually tell. A bit more. Yeah. And I'll be honest with you, that's basically it for Hornby's development. The design that they use to date on their new released steam locos is basically the same as this. There are some differences. Some of them use different shapes and sizes of motor depending on the loco. Some of the motors have flywheels added to them, and some of the locos are a little bit more serviceable, but there have been no major design changes since around 2000 for Hornby. And that's not a criticism either, because as you can see, they just work amazingly. And in fact, most new Hornby locos produced today don't run as well as this one does, and other locos from this year. It's a strange phenomenon, but it is known as the Hornby Golden Era. So off it goes, the Hornby Merchant Navy. Still one of the best running locomotives ever, and it's really only now that the likes of Bachmann and also other manufacturers are actually able to match this sort of thing. So quite a massive achievement really for Hornby back in the day. So with Hornby making such massive strides, it clearly wouldn't be too long before Hornby's main competitor Bachmann would have to do the same. And sure enough, within a few years, Bachmann also made some major changes to their locomotive mechanisms. They changed them to be more like their diesels, so no longer split chassis, pickups on the driving wheels, and they moved to their ubiquitous 3-pole motor, a variation of which appearing in the vast majority of Bachmann steam locomotives for the next 10 to 15 years or so. And sure enough, this was sufficient to make the Bachmann locomotive match the performance of the Hornby locomotive, although admittedly it would be a long time before they were building loco mechanisms that were as high quality as the Hornby ones. It was also around this era that DCC, or digital operation, started to be seen. This standard class 4 locomotive was, I believe, one of the first locos to have a DCC socket inside it, and obviously DCC is a whole other subject which I'm not going to get into today, but arguably yes, that was another way in which locomotive performance was further improved. Anyway, let's take a look at one of Bachmann's new generation steam locomotives. Let's see what the performance on this thing is like. As you can see, noticeably nice and smooth, fairly quiet, and the pickups were always good, so they were just as reliable as the split chassis locomotives, although now a little bit more long lasting, even though they didn't have proper bearings on the driving axles or anything like that most of the time. The axles at least didn't wear out like the plastic split chassis ones did. Anyway, how is the slow speed? Easing it up. As you can see, not quite as good as the Merchant Navy, but pretty good as it stopped. Oh, it's cut out. Come on. Oh, I just had to turn it up a bit more. Okay. Try again. Let's have another crawl, please. So as you can see, it's not behaving quite as well as the Merchant Navy, but it's in the same ballpark, and this would not stop you from buying a loco like this during this era, although it's done it again. No tender pickups, I should say. Yeah, like I say, they did not manage to match Hornby on quality for a long time. A lot of Bachmann locos did not have power pickup in the tender. That's another thing that the Hornby 2000 locos did. Keeps getting to that point and stopping, doesn't it? That's weird. Anyway, decent performers, generally speaking. It's worth noting that now we're into the modern era, it's not just Hornby versus Bachmann anymore, plus a couple of other smaller manufacturers. There are obviously a lot of other companies making models such as Helgen, Dapol, Accurascale, you name it, there's a whole load of them now. However, in terms of mechanical design, which is what we're talking about today, the vast majority of them follow what the big boys are doing. And so for an example, I've got here a Helgen Class 26, I believe it is, and this is very similar to the way a Bachmann diesel would be constructed, if not to the same high quality. It's the same idea though, powerful motor in the middle, dual flywheels to each of the bogies, all-wheel drive with wiper pickups on them. And that is pretty much the way with all modern diesels, barring the old Hornby railroad ones or whatever. But the performance on most manufacturers' locos of this design is good. I mean, a Helgen mechanism is fairly cheap. Yeah, it's not as high quality as a Bachmann, but for the most part they do run silky smooth. I mean, this one's very quiet. The crawl can vary. Helgen don't always use 5-pole motors, so you don't always get the best crawl, but we'll see what this one's like. Turning up a bit more, so it's not bad. Yeah, a little bit jerky, but pretty much decent, I would say, and acceptable. And of course, Helgen's thing is heavy locos as well. That is one thing that Helgen do better than Bachmann. So in terms of pulling power, as you would see on the stat screen, a Helgen locomotive is what you buy if you want an awful lot of power. So I've already mentioned that Hornby in the early 2000s pretty much got their steam locomotive mechanisms spot on, and I also said that Bachmann's were not quite at the same level. And so that means that while Hornby are still producing pretty much the same design as in the early 2000s, it's necessitated a change in Bachmann's designs much more recently. So really over the last couple of years we have seen Bachmann upgrade their steam locomotives to coreless motors. Bachmann were not the first company to do this. Dave Jones Models was pretty much the first pioneer of coreless motors, at least in British double-O gauge locomotives, but he used cheap, nasty ones that didn't perform that well. More recently, Bachmann have been using quite substantial coreless motors, which do actually have quite a lot of power and control to them. And this actually puts Bachmann in quite a strong position because they've now got good small motors that can fit into perhaps smaller and more unusual locomotives. And we've started to see that with the likes of the Precedent class. But here I've got the Caledonian 812, which does have a coreless motor inside it. And I have to say it does run pretty well. These locos run too fast, and I think that's because possibly the RPM of a coreless motor is higher than what Bachmann were using in the past. But I'm pretty sure that they will improve the gearing as time goes on, so that the slow speed performance on these locos is better. But generally I do think coreless are starting to get better now than 5-pole motors. They're more efficient, they're quieter, and they don't require as much maintenance, and the failure rate seems to be very low. I don't think I've ever known a coreless motor to fail. So let's have a look at the crawl. It's not bad, I've got to say. When you consider that this loco is way too fast to be realistic at half speed, and it can still do a fantastic crawl at the low end, just shows the power that coreless motors have. Yeah, it's wonderful. And speaking of the power and the acceleration, let me hit it with 50% speed. It's just an immediate acceleration. The wheels slip because they accelerate so much. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that Bachmann are now ahead of Hornby on motors, because the Hornby motors are still decent. I still like a good 5-pole motor, but we're starting to see some locos a bit like this perform even better than a modern Hornby loco. So maybe Hornby will also change to coreless one day. Well, that is for the future. So there you have it then, folks. That was a very quick look at the development of model train mechanisms over here in the UK, spanning from the late 1930s right up until the present day. Obviously, I've had to miss quite a lot out. I've crammed as much as possible into this time, but obviously there's still a lot more that I haven't covered. So please don't feel the need to send me comments to let me know that I've missed this or that development. Trust me, I know. But if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more, obviously there is a lot more I can talk about, so do comment down below and let me know that. And if enough of you do, then I will make another video on this subject. I'm not sure exactly what, but sure, maybe in the future. Also, an interesting question to close with would be, what would you like to see added to model trains in the future? What sort of features, what sort of developments do you think or do you want to see in the future? All right, that's an interesting one. For now though, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you soon for some more videos. All right, folks, cheers everybody, take care.